Hi, I'm Shelley, resident of Victoria, Australia, and someone who loves to travel. This presentation is part of a private project to see as much as possible of my home state by public transport, now that daily fares have been capped, making it so affordable. Before we start, I acknowledge that I am presenting from the lands of the Bunurong people, that the trip was taken on the lands of the Jabwurrung people, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. This particular trip was over the weekend before the Cup Day public holiday on Tuesday, so we sort of made it a long weekend, although my partner did work from the hotel on Monday. As always, we booked on the V-Line site. This did not have reserved seating, so we just had to find seats together when we got there and save one for Phil, who was joining us further down the line. We booked accommodation on Flight Rewards again, so this was the total base cost of the 4 days. However, we went to a lot more paid tourist sites this time, so the weekend did cost a fair bit more than that overall. So the three of us started at Southern Cross and our friend Phil joined us a little further down the line. Now I have to say that one of the things I love about travelling by rail is that I can use my time productively rather than driving or staring out the window, so I don't get travel sick. This means that I often don't appreciate the journey as much as I could. However, I love a wind generator and there were so many wind farms that we got really close to along this route. We had a friendly and informative train driver who warned us that Ararat station is very small. She was right. On our walk into town, we passed by the site of the Common School, the first permanent school building. Our first stop was, of course, visitor information, where the staff were really helpful, and it's also the art gallery. They were showing the annual art prize pieces, and we could vote on the people's choice. I realised that my preference tended to lean in the direction of the biggest pieces. Although I did love this documentation of the remaining critically endangered red gums of the Briargolong area. There was also a special exhibition made of uh, recycled rubbish, basically. We popped into the supermarket to get ourselves some lunch, which we enjoyed in the Alexandra Gardens. Google Maps told us it would take about a quarter of an hour to walk to J Ward, and this involved following the road, but we were already in the gardens and continued to cut through. It took minutes, leaving us with a lot of time to explore the gardens further. This cannon had a possum asleep inside its mouth. Now, J Ward. Before I explain more about it, let me tell you my story in the spirit of you can learn from my mistakes without making them yourself, but also because you might like the laugh. I had done a nighttime tour of this criminal psychiatric unit many, many years before. We checked out the options a couple of weeks before we left and decided that while they did do a nighttime ghost tours, the daytime tours had more availability, were significantly cheaper, and were run by volunteers, so we thought they'd be more historical. My thought was that we'd wait until we knew the train was going to get in on time and then try to book a 1 p.m. Saturday tour, the afternoon we arrived. I had the website up on my phone browser ready for this purpose. While we were on the train before Phil boarded, I had a quick look just to check if they had availability that afternoon, and the only places they had available before Wednesday were two places on Sunday at 10 a.m. I panicked and booked those two for my son and his dad to go. I don't know what happened here, but we're lucky it did. It only booked the child place. So then I quickly searched up J Ward to book the last place. Suddenly there was a lot more availability, so I was able to book 3 adults for Sunday 10 a.m. And then I noticed the tickets were $5 cheaper than they'd been at before. This was when we noticed that while both sets of tickets were issued by Friends of J Ward, the child ticket was for Arradale Lunatic Asylum day tour and the adults for J Ward. A quick internet search confirmed they are not the same thing or even in the same place. I'll explain more about the differences later, but once we got into Ararat, we called and switched the J Ward tickets to Saturday afternoon, added a child to that booking, and then when we got to J Ward, I asked for the child ticket to Arradale to be changed to an adult for myself and went on my own on the Sunday. As I work in mental health, I thought I would find it more interesting than the others who might not be up to it after already seeing J Ward the day before. So the building of J Ward began its life as a goldfields jail. When the gold rush petered out, it was determined a jail was no longer needed. In 1886, it was declared a ward of the nearby Ararat Lunatic Asylum, as it was known then. This particular ward was used to house the criminally insane. This was when it got its name of J Ward, as the asylum had wards A to I already. Even as early as 1907, there were some quite scathing reviews of this idea of keeping mentally unwell people in prison conditions. Apparently, in the early days, there was a wall at the back of the garden, with the patient accommodations being behind that, meaning that the well-to-do ladies could promenade among these beautiful flower gardens on the weekends. We saw the single warders' quarters and the married warders' quarters. Can you imagine raising 7 children in a home this size? There were 3 ships painted on the walls in the outside. This is the best preserved due to it being later repainted, and they were painted by an ex-mariner. We heard stories about how residents used to pass the time, and also heard the stories of the oldest incarcerated person in the world and also the longest incarceration in the world, both of which were apparently here. There were some very confronting stories about children being kept here. This was carved by someone who was disappointed he didn't receive any letters, so he decided to carve out a letterbox in the wall. These carvings, there were quite a few along that wall, could take any time from days to years. Some of the stories were of people I could remember hearing about, such as Gary Webb and Chopper Read. We all found it quite confronting. Back into Ararat, we were staying at the Colonial Lodge Motel, which was nice and clean and a fantastic location just across the road from the supermarket and practically across the road from the gardens. Phil stayed at the Courthouse Hotel, which unfortunately didn't have rooms that would accommodate our family. That's why we weren't there, just around the corner, which he said was great. We all had a lovely dinner there on Saturday night. The Alexandra Gardens are a great place for an early morning run. Also, I was very excited to hear they have an outdoor Olympic pool, which is free, and I was told initially at tourist information was open for the summer. It's actually only open from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. for lap swimming, and only when the temperature is over 23 degrees Celsius, which it never was while we were there, unfortunately. Still, it's good to keep in mind for if we go later in the year. As I mentioned earlier, I went out to Ararat Asylum on my own on the Sunday morning. It's quite a hike to get out to, about 40 minutes. There is a bus, but that doesn't run on Sundays, and the tours are only on Sundays and Wednesdays. It really is very confronting. Arradale is not able to be restored the way that J Ward has been. I asked why this is, and the indications were that it's probably money related, but it's also because of the preferences of those past residents who are still alive. I do wonder if there's a bit of concern that if it was restored, it might be done in a way that looks a bit like whitewashing the past. An internet search indicated that it might also be due to occupational health and safety concerns. The site is now part of Melbourne Polytechnic's Ararat campus, but the buildings are not in use by them for these tours. For a long time, Arradale housed over 1,000 patients and a high ratio of staff to support them. It was described as a town within a town. Arradale is surrounded by a ha-ha wall, which is a lot taller on one side than the other. There's this kind of moat on the inside, but looks the same height from both sides. Here's the view from one of the buildings where you can see it looks much shorter than it really is on that side. As I said, I work in mental health, so it was really interesting to me learning about how practices have changed over the years. It was here that I learned a lot more about Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax, who pioneered several innovative practices aimed at a more humane experience. And those included anesthesia during ECT, some psychopharmacology, and also art therapy for residents. The guide did warn us before taking us into the morgue, but to be honest, I found it walking around the normal buildings and even the grounds a lot more confronting. In short, I'm glad I went, but I equally think it was the right decision for the others not to come. If you are getting around on foot like we were, I would suggest prioritising J Ward as it's closer to town, more set up for tourism, not quite as confronting, but you still learn heaps of history, including that of mental health care. While I was doing that, the others were taking a self guided walking tour of the historical buildings in Ararat. They said it seemed to be mostly lots of hotels, but they obviously saw places that were important civic buildings as well. Following that walk, they went on to enjoy a relaxed lunch before heading to the Gum San Heritage Centre. Ararat is unique in Australia and I think maybe the world in being the only goldfields town established by Chinese people. Already knew that this happened because they were travelling overland to the main goldfields when they found gold. What I didn't realise was that the reason they were travelling overland was because the ship captain was cheating them. The Victorian government insisted on receiving £10 for every Chinese person on board a ship that docked in Victoria. Ship's captains would collect this from passengers when they boarded, but then drop them off at Robe in South Australia, where they didn't have to pay that tax. It was while they were resting during the long, arduous trek from there to the goldfields that they stumbled upon what became known as the Canton Lead. When they eventually had to buy supplies in a nearby town and used gold to do so, the European miners became aware of the rich area. And, as is unfortunately a feature of much of our history, they came and persecuted the Chinese miners, eventually driving them off. Like all goldfield towns, the Chinese miners had a huge influence on Ararat. In Ararat, the vast majority came from this one tiny area in China. The volunteer who greeted me when I arrived to join the others proudly showed me his daughter in law's wedding dress. Did you know that roof spouting and normal downpipes are not used in these types of buildings because they harbour evil spirits? We were probably trying to cram too much into the one day, but I think this was the only day we had left to see the Railway Museum. It's right by the train station, and while it is quite small, has some cool things to look at, books to peruse, and really interesting people to talk to. On Monday morning, we did the Ararat Dividing Walk, or a section of it. The brochure said it had views of Mount Ararat and wildlife such as kangaroos and echidnas. We did see one kangaroo, but the other wildlife we saw was mostly roadkill lizards on the road. There were burnt out areas, probably from controlled burns, and there were other interesting sights to see. To be honest, when we come out this way normally for walking, we go all the way into Hall's Gap for the stunning Grampians walks from there. If we hadn't been with a teenager who had had enough and also someone who needed to get back to start work, we could have extended this walk to take in One Tree Hill. Phil actually got up early and did the One Tree Hill walk the following day, and he said he did actually see lots of kangaroos then. Look, it was a nice enough walk, but there are definitely much better further into the Grampians. The main other thing we did that day was that the three of us who weren't working caught up for a barbecue lunch in the gardens. Before heading home on the Tuesday, we popped into the Langi Morgala Museum. This was the only day it was open that we could go. Unfortunately, a burglary a few weeks prior meant that they no longer allow photography inside, but there was so much to see. Some of the things that stood out for us were the printing machine that you set using a typewriter type device, some old calculating machines, an old machine for creating the pats of butter, um, and also quite well documented Aboriginal artefacts. Then there were the stoves, the brownie uniform, and the bicentennial badges that we recognised from our own childhood. We took in a couple of more sites. These ones were from the driving tour before heading home. I think we got a lot packed into that weekend, even though we did have a bit of downtime as well. Here's a few helpful sources of information. And this, I think, was probably the most helpful. We got it from the visitor centre, and I thought it might be helpful to have ahead of time. It's just a lot of the sites that are around the area, and that's the codes to get the links to them. Thanks.